And we are live, so welcome everybody here to A Simple Faith tonight to continue our study of John. And those who are watching online, live at this moment on Facebook, and then those who will see this later on YouTube, we're glad that you are here. I imagine that Garrett has already posted the wonderful handout online for folks to get that. So I hope you get it. It's quiz time. Of course, it's quiz time, and so check your knowledge about how well you paid attention last week, and that'll get us started as a little bit of a review, and then we'll get moving. Question number 1 tonight. 2 key verses from the Gospel of John are being used in this study to highlight John's major purpose in writing. Do you know what those 2 verses are? John 6:29 and John 20:31. Those are the two of the clearest places where John says, "This is written so that you will believe in the one whom God has sent." This is the will of God, that you believe in the one God has sent. Question 2, Ronnie has referred multiple times to John's Gospel as the New Testament's best version of blank propaganda. Holy propaganda. That's exactly right. John is writing with an angle, more so than any other writer in the New Testament. 3, the Gospels are arranged in most English Bibles in the following order: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Who put those books in order and why? Augustine or Augustine. We would say Augustine if we were educated properly, but we live in Florida, so it's Augustine most of the time, named after the city, named after the same guy. So Augustine is the one who put those in that order, about 400 AD. And why did he put those in that order? He thought that was the order in which they were written, and that has maintained that particular order over all these years. Question 4, while Mark was written first of the 4 canonical Gospels, his work was likely preceded by a collection of written sayings and stories of Jesus known as the what source? The Q source. The Q source stands for Quelle, Quelle, which is the German word for source. German scholars sussed that out. Question 5, blank percent of John is unique to his book and not found in the other 3 synoptic Gospels. 90% of John is unique. 6, the conclusion that Jesus had a 3-year ministry is arrived at by what feature in the Gospel of John? The number of Passovers that we find Jesus attending. 7, which of the Gospels was in circulation before the letters of Paul? None. Paul's letters were in circulation first. Number 8, the concept of the Logos originated with what group of thinkers? Philo is a good guess, good answer. It's a little further down the road. Go back a little further. Plato's right on. I was looking for the Greeks. It actually predates Plato, but Plato is the one who institutionalized it. It originates with the Greeks about 500 years before Jesus. And 9, Mickey's already answered this one, but I'll ask it anyway. What Greek-trained Jewish philosopher attempted to synthesize Greek philosophy with Jewish theology? Say it again, Mickey. No, the other one. Philo of Alexandria. And then number 10, the only other text in the New Testament that's comparable to the prologue of John's Gospel was found where? No? It's Colossians 1, verses 15 through 20. I read it just at the end of our session last week. So, I got a couple questions from you this week. I'd like to begin there by way of review. And sometimes folks are a little timid to ask their questions, Lord, in front of people, but you'll send them to me, and I appreciate that, so I'll try to answer a couple of those. First question, do you have to know the extensive background of John to benefit from reading John? No, absolutely not. Jesus' sayings and stories can stand alone. You don't need all the information that you got last week. You won't need all the information that you get over these weeks, but it is extremely helpful to understand John in context. For example, we read the opening lines, "In the beginning was the Word," and Christians often associate the Word with the Bible. And if you take that assumption at the beginning of John, it's not going to be long until you've wandered deep into the weeds and you misunderstand almost everything that follows. Because John is using a different term for word, the Logos, the very mind of God. So, no, you don't need all of that, but it will certainly open the text up the more that you know about the background. Question 2, did Philo succeed in uniting Greek and Jewish thought? That is an excellent question, by the way. And the answer is yes and no. Yes in the short run, no in the long run. So in the first century, Philo was very influential. And he was very influential on the Jewish writers of the New Testament. It's called Hellenization, named after what the Greeks called their own land was Hellas, Helen. And Hellenization is the process by which the Greek culture and Greek language overtook the world. And it goes all the way back to Alexander the Great, 325 years before Jesus. Alexander the Great conquered Europe, the Mediterranean, North Africa, the Middle East, all the way to India. And his grip on civilization was so strong, and the Greek language so strong, that it prevailed for the hundreds and hundreds of years that followed. And Greek culture infiltrated all the cultures that it came in contact with. So in that regard, Judaism is no different. Philo was attempting to adapt and to take on the Greek language. And over the years, it was very profound in its effect on Judaism, especially in the first century. And it didn't last, and I'll get to why that is the case. But slide number 1, this is Acts chapter 6, verse number 1 in the Bible. Now at this time, as the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint developed on the part of the what Jews? The Hellenistic Jews against the native Hebrews, because their widows were being overlooked in the daily serving of food. So this is very early in the church's history. And you have two groups. They're all Jews, but they're two distinct groups within that. The native Jews speak Aramaic, they read the Hebrew Scriptures, and they hold to the traditional culture of the Jewish people. And most of them are native to the Palestine, Roman Palestinia, and Judea. The Hellenistic Jews are from all over the world. They speak Greek, they wear Greek clothing, and they read the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And so you have Greek Jews and you have native Jews. They're coming together in this new thing called the church. But you see this conflict because the Hellenistic Jews felt like they were being discriminated against because they were not native to Jerusalem. Human problems are human problems no matter what age that you live in. But that's a good example of the difference between these two groups. And so Philo was very influential in the first century, and then after Jerusalem was destroyed, the Hellenization of the Jews fell out of favor because most of the Jewish population returned to their traditional ways as a means of survival. You no longer had a temple, you no longer had a capital city, you no longer had a country. And the Jews were scattered across the world. And rather than becoming like other cultures that really enforced this distinctiveness where they would stand off, and so Hellenization fell out of favor with the Jews. But it continued with the early church fathers, and particularly the Greek Orthodox Church. Philo and the Greek philosophers, their interpretation of the Scriptures prevailed all the way into the the second millennium, and continues. And then third question, and I got this one a couple times. Where can I read about this deep background of the Gospel of John for myself? Well, I just brought it for you. Here they all are. And I gave you a bibliography if you want to look up some of the books that I'm using. Now, this isn't all the books I'm using for our study, but this is some of them. If I was a plumber, these would just be wrenches, right? If I was an electrician, it would be, what would it be, Kevin? Wire cutters and splicers and all those things. These are just tools that I use. There is no need for you to go out and spend. I mean, this is over $500 worth of books right here, because they're academic books and they're weighty and heavy and all this stuff. If you want to do the deep background dive, you can do that. I gave you a partial bibliography there for you. Ranging from sort of devotional. William Barclay is more of a devotional writer, but he is also a scholar. And then it goes all the way to like the Augsburg Commentary and the Word Biblical Commentary. They really have a lot of depth to them. I recommend highly John for Normal People, written by Jennifer Garcia Basha. It's published by the Bible for Normal People, Pete Enns. And it will take all of this technical stuff and puts it down into just little paragraphs. Because it's explaining without giving you all the background. It just cuts to the chase. And so I highly recommend that one. And one of the reasons, there's a couple reasons really, that we, in the church I grew up in, and some of you will have had this same experience. We didn't make these deep dives like we're doing for a number of reasons. Number one, in my tradition, too much book learning was looked down upon. Oh, you just think you're so smart. If you went off and got an education, you were too good, to come back and be with the people that didn't get an education. So, a little education was good, but not too much. Don't start worrying about all those letters at the end of your name, kind of a thing. And then two, most of the preachers and teachers of my tradition simply did not have access to academic commentaries. Because if you don't go to school, you don't get these commentaries. So they used Matthew Henry, sometimes William Barclay. Warren Wiersbe was one that was popular, in the tradition in which I grew up. They're lighter. They're much more devotional. You read this, here's the thought for the day, or something that could help you with a sermon. Not so much about the deeper stuff. And then a big piece of this is that academic commentaries are frightening to some faith communities. If you start diving into all the technical and you start raising questions, all you're going to do is make people doubt the Bible. And for me, nothing could be further from the truth. Now, this is me speaking. I want the hard-hitting, mind-bending, history-explaining, content-defining, text-criticizing, devotional-busting thinkers, because they force me to read the Bible closer than I would if I were just picking up and reading it for myself. We are so far removed from the time these texts were written, and we are so locked in and locked up by the established interpretations that I like the more challenging stuff. So don't go out and buy all that stuff. If you want to borrow it, I'll let you borrow anything that is on my shelf. And a lot of mine now, and I think Garrett just had this experience, has been converted to software. So my library is a quarter the size it used to be, because it's all in the cloud. So let's hope the cloud doesn't do what Verizon has done today. My phone hasn't worked all day, so I don't know if yours is working or not. Where am I here? I already lost my way. All right, let's get started tonight. And I gave you a very simple outline there to begin with. It's right from the NIV Study Bible, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. And we're not going to cover every verse of this outline, but I'm going to highlight a few things for us as we go. And if we can, just move to slide, the next slide, chapter 1 there. Flesh, forerunner, and followers. That's what the first chapter of John is about. By flesh, I'm speaking of the incarnation of Jesus. John 1:14, William Barclay says, the very reason that John or anyone would want to write a gospel gets right to it. And John says something amazing in John 1:14 that's not said anywhere else in Scripture. So the Word became human and made His home among us. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness, as we have seen, and we have seen His glory, the glory of the Father's one and only Son. So let's review a couple things here first. John said in his prologue that the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word existed in the beginning, and the Word is the source of all creation. It is the light and life of the universe. What is the Word that John speaks about? Well, last week we learned that it was an extremely Greek concept that every thinking person at the end of the first century in the Roman Empire would have known. Logos, the Word of God, is the expression of God. It is God's idea. It is God's logic. It is God's reasoning. It is the conversation that God has with the world. And the Greeks coined the word, and it became this principle by which they understood that everything was made and everything was held together by the Logos, by the mind of God. And so you spring forward to Philo, and he's the first one that makes the connection between Logos and the image of God in us. He says, Genesis 1:27, for God made man and woman in God's image. Philo said, that's Logos. Here's God's mind and God's idea birthed into the world. We are made in God's image. John picks that up and takes it further than anyone has ever taken it. And he says that the Logos is Jesus, existing with God, as God, the creative and sustaining force of the universe. And then he gets here to John 14, and he says, the mind of God, get this, became a person. The very expression and creative power of God became a human being. John is the only one of the gospel writers to say anything like this. The synoptics don't speak of Jesus like this at all. Neither does Paul, not really. It's really unique. And John would say that is because Jesus is unique. If you look at that phrase, the Father's one and only Son. Do you have that on your page there, on your handout? Mono, or we would say almost monogynous, mono, one, and genus. Do you remember what genus is? It's a specimen, it's a type. The Greek word that John uses is this, the one and only Son of God, mono, one single species. He's the only animal like this one. No other animal like this exists. John will use this phrase, one and only, mono with genus together. He will use it 4 times in his gospel. And he uses it the first time right out of the bat, speaking about the very uniqueness of Jesus. He's the only such animal. So that's how the gospel starts. So you know you're dealing with something radically different than the other synoptic gospels. We move quickly then from there to the forerunner. And that forerunner is John the Baptist. John the Baptist testified about him when he shouted to the crowds, "This is the one I was talking about when I said, 'Someone is coming after me who is far greater than I am, for he existed long before me.'" What do we know about John the Baptist? Well, first of all, we know that he had a sort of angelic birth himself. His birth was very unlikely. His mother had been barren. And an angel shows up and says to his father, your wife's going to have a child. And his father, who was a temple priest, a high-ranking temple priest, didn't believe it. And so the angel struck him dumb. It's one of my favorite passages. He says, Gabriel says to his father, Zechariah, 9 months from now, your wife's going to give birth to a son. And Zechariah says, prove it. And Gabriel says, I am Gabriel. It's like he was saying, do you know who I am? And just for that, you ain't be able to talk till the baby's born, and shut him up. To which his wife was very grateful. Do what?
What age was he?
He was an old man by then. He was an old man by then. She was, and she had been barren.
Would you have said any differently?
Do what?
Would you have said any differently?
I don't know what I would have done if Gabriel showed up at my bedside. I'd be a little bewildered by that fact. Now, if Gabriel shows up tonight and says that Cindy is going to give birth to, I will not be happy about it. I'm old now too. I would not. That would be very terrifying to me. Anyway. So John is designated as the forerunner, the witness that will go before the Messiah. That's going to be his role. He is a cousin of Jesus. Cousins via his mother and John's mother. Elizabeth and Mary are related. So these boys grew up together. They knew each other. He refused.
Is that not true?
Maybe, but we don't really know about that one. The question was, I thought John the Beloved was a cousin of Jesus. That's a possibility. But certainly John the Baptist and Jesus are cousins. So John's father being a temple priest, John should have become a temple priest. He refused that role. And we find him out in the desert eating wild honey and locusts and dressed in a hair shirt and the classic fire and brimstone preacher. We think that he spent time in the desert with the Essenes. The Essenes are the community that put to scroll and preserve the Dead Sea Scrolls. So if you go to Qumran today and you go and see where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 1948, 1949, that was an Essene community. And what we discovered in the early 1950s is that John the Baptizer is mentioned in the scrolls as the priest who came to us and then left to preach in the desert. So it's an amazing historical find that we didn't know existed until 75 years ago. It's wonderful. And so John was connected to these Essenes. These Essenes were retreatists. They had moved to the desert on purpose. Think of them as theological doomsday preppers. They were living in the desert just waiting for the temple to collapse because they said it's so corrupt. The system is so corrupt. The nation is so corrupt. Let it all just fall into hell. And they were very fiery about that. And you can tell in John's preaching that he's calling the Pharisees and the leaders from Jerusalem. He says, "You brood of vipers, who warned you about the judgment to come?" Insinuating, I wish the ground would just open and swallow you up too. He's saying that to the leading theologians of his day. And this wild man in the desert. And the Essenes also were deliberate baptizers. They baptized each other every day in these giant ceremonial tubs. So after dinner every night, you would walk, and if you've been to Israel and you've been to Qumran with me, you've stood in one of these. It's this massive tub about the size of this stage. And you enter on one side down, interesting enough, 12 steps. And then you come out the other side with 12 steps, the 12 tribes of Israel. Has nothing to do with AA, but it's a pretty cool thing. So 12 steps in, 12 steps out. And it's water, and they self-baptize to cleanse themselves every day. And that is no small feat when you live in the desert. To go carry that kind of water every day for the entire community to be baptized in. So John, again, is showing his influence with and by the Essenes. He's adamant that he is not the one to come, but he is preparing the way for the one to come. And this is true in all the Gospels. He was extremely popular. Hundreds and hundreds of people came out to hear him preach. He had a little cult of personality around him that prevailed all the way to the time of Paul. You can find Christian missionaries in the book of Acts encountering those who had been baptized with John's baptism but didn't know who Jesus was because they were so enamored with him. And he uses this apocalyptic and kingly title for Jesus, "Behold the Lamb of God." Strange, you might say, a strange designation. And we immediately think of the cross because we're looking at all this hindsight. But the lamb was the symbol of the last Jewish kings in Jerusalem. Do you remember when we were doing the Christian history thing a couple years ago and we talked about the Maccabees? What does the word Maccabean mean? Please, anybody? The hammers. There's this little group of fighters and they throw off the Greeks, because the Greeks had desecrated the temple. And the Maccabees fight, get the temple back, and then they have this period of about 100 years of self-rule. And the Maccabees became the kings. And their symbol on everything was the Lamb of God, because they had restored proper sacrifices at the temple. And so when John uses that phrase, "Behold the Lamb of God," he is using it two ways. He is speaking of the true king that has arrived, that everybody knew that was the last symbol of the Jewish monarchy. And he's speaking of Jesus as sacrifice, the sacrificial system, the one that will replace and supersede the sacrificial system. And then finally, John is ultimately murdered by King Herod. King Herod didn't like his preaching because he was always on Herod's case. And he arrested him and threw him in jail, and then at a party one night gets tricked into beheading him. You just have to read that for yourself. And Jesus said of John the Baptist that he was the greatest man ever born. No man born of woman will exceed John the Baptist. So they were close, childhood friends, childhood family. Their ministries arise together. John goes ahead and prepares the way, and then Jesus goes beyond him. And then from there, and I'm going to stop a minute and take your questions, but then from there, chapter 1 gives us the first disciples of Jesus. If you pick up at John 1:35 and following, we discover their names. Andrew is the first, and we have an unnamed follower, which has to be the writer. It just has to be John, the way that the language is used. And they were originally followers of John the Baptist. And John the Baptist shoos them away and says, "No, go follow that guy." And then Andrew brings his brother to Jesus, who's named Simon. Jesus takes one look at him and nicknames him Rocky. Cephas in the Aramaic, Peter in the Greek. And then from there, Philip, Andrew, and Peter are all from the same town, Bethsaida, not far from Capernaum. And then finally we get Nathanael. Nathanael scoffed when they said they had found the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. And Nathanael laughs and says, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" It is rude, but it was proper at the same time, because Nazareth was a hornet's nest. It was way up, it's a hillside village way up in Galilee, nothing but a bunch of troublemaking hillbillies that talk about thumping their chest about how Israel's going to rise again. I mean, really, that's what they did. When Jesus was a child in Nazareth, there was such a rebellion there that 3 legions of Roman soldiers rode in from Caesarea and crucified 2,000 rebels along the sides of the road for miles to put down the rebellion at Nazareth. Jesus, as a little boy, would have seen those bodies hanging on those crosses. It is a cauldron of rebellion. It'd be like, on its best day, it would be like Belfast during the Troubles. On its worst days, something like Tikrit after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Very violent, hard scrabble, tough. And so, hey, Jesus of Nazareth, everybody laughed at Nazareth. They were nothing but a bunch of troublemakers. But then when Nathanael comes to Jesus, Jesus repays that little sneer with a compliment, and he says, before me, how does he say it in the text? I think you got it there. Here is a true Israelite, in whom there is no guile. And John puts those words there on purpose because only a true Israelite can recognize the true God. And so when Jesus says that back to him, he's complimenting Nathanael, but John is also working his propaganda there. That these men recognize God in Jesus of Nazareth. That's chapter 1. Questions?
I understand that under the 7 titles, all of those have always been fixed to me except Son of Man. Explain
Okay, there's a great question right down here. Thank you for seeing that in your notes. I jumped past it. John chapter 1 gives us 7 titles of Jesus. Again, holy propaganda at the opening bell. Word, Lamb of God, Son of God, Rabbi, Messiah, King, Son of Man. Son of Man is Jesus' most favorite term for himself. It is self-referential all the time. And it is connected back to the suffering servant of Isaiah, where the prophet says, O Son of Man. And Son of Man is sort of a backhanded messianic reference, but it's Jesus' way of identifying with the suffering servant of Isaiah who would perish for his people, a human being. He is Son of God, Son of Man. He is both. And it's how Jesus most often refers to himself. And it's a prophetic title from the prophets. Very intentional by Jesus in what he's doing. It's a very good question. Rose. Yeah, the question is, there's another title, the light. You could say that. You know, it's not light like with a capital L there. It's used in a more general sense. But as you'll see this coming Sunday, Jesus says, I am the light of the world a little bit later. And he takes that title up officially then. Mm-hmm.
How are you using the word propaganda? What does that mean?
The question is, how are you using the word propaganda? I'm not using it in the negative sense. I'm using it in the sense that propaganda is any communication that is slanted for a purpose. And John is slanted with a purpose. Hard. Yeah. Not in the sense of trying to get you to believe something that isn't true. But certainly, he's beating a drum constantly. Every step of the way. Yes. It did. Kevin is, just repeating for the online audience, Kevin is making reference to the end of John chapter 1 where Nathanael's already kind of waved Jesus off. And when he comes to Jesus, Jesus says, I saw you sitting under the fig tree, which was this prophetic vision that I knew where you were before you arrived here. And the fig tree isn't accidental either. The fig tree is the Old Testament symbol of the nation of Israel, which dogpiles with what we've already said about that. And so he's saying, you're a true Israelite. I saw you sitting under the fig tree. All those are going together. And it was startling. And it pulled Nathanael in immediately.
Follow up on that. Right after it says, you'll see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending.
Mm-hmm.
What's he talking about?
I think what he's talking about there is the transfiguration. The question was, you'll heaven open and see angels rising and descending. But we're going to see before we leave tonight that he could be referencing something else. But in the big scheme of things, he's talking about the glory of God. Specifically, it could be the transfiguration. More generally, it could be the 7 miracles that Jesus performs within the Gospel of John. Another good question. Yes?
I usually get snagged up on the psychology behind things,
Mhm.
and I think that's where I've come in a snag. But I think I understand John's driven mission. What psychologically I don't understand, the other disciples that have written of the same stories don't put John with Jesus every step of the way. And John puts John every step of the way.
Sarah makes an observation here from the psychological standpoint. John is with Jesus every step of the way in the Gospel of John, but not so much in the synoptic Gospels. He's a little more sidelined there, but not completely. He's still in the inner circle of Jesus in the synoptic Gospels. And again, I think John is writing, the only way that John can be a propagandist is to be an eyewitness and speak of his personal up-close experience as beholding the glory of God up close and personal. And I think that's why he's doing it more in John.
But I shouldn't disbelieve John.
I don't think you should disbelieve John. I think John's spiritual experience is different than the other writers. We're going to see that here in just a second in the second chapter. I'll hold that and then I'll answer it in the second chapter. Real quick, let me move to the second chapter. Time flies. Mom, miracles, and mayhem. That's what happens in the second chapter. First to mom, to mother. Jesus' mother, Mother Mary, John 2, verse number 1, finally arrives on the scene. I say finally, it's only been one chapter, but Jesus is 30 years old, and so now we meet her for the first time. The next day, there was a wedding celebration in the village of Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there. There's no birth account in John's gospel. There are no flashbacks to Jesus' childhood. Mary just suddenly appears. He doesn't really need to introduce her. The synoptics have already done that. And they were written before John writes his gospel. He has no time to mess with all this childhood stuff. He's getting right to it. And she's at this wedding in Cana. And Cana is 7-8 miles from Nazareth. If you stand in Nazareth, out on that precipice where they were going to push Jesus over the edge and kill him a little bit later, if you stand right there, you can see Cana over two valleys away. So it wasn't easy to get to. It's like this. But these communities know each other. They're close by. And so Mary, Jesus, they probably know the people who are getting married. And then the worst social faux pas occurs. They run out of wine. And this is the kind of mistake that would get the father of the bride run out of town. I mean, people have come for miles to party for days, and you've run out of wine. That's a problem. And if you look at it, Mary says to Jesus, "Psst, they're out of wine." Trying to play it real cool. Jesus' response is verse 4. Dear woman, we would even say my lady. He's being respectful. Some of the older translations are gruff. Woman. That's how he's like, that seems always rough. But it is, dear woman, my lady, that's not our problem, he says. And then he says, my time has not yet come. He doesn't want any of the attention yet. And then Mary does what moms do. She ignored him. Quote, but his mother then told the servants, do whatever he tells you. She's going to prevail. Her persistence outlasts his resistance. So he goes around back and he says, bring me some water pots. They bring him 6 water jars that can hold 30 gallons. These are ceremonial wash pots. And he turns it to wine. And it's wine. Don't let your Baptist neighbors tell you it's not. They're all getting drunk. They're getting hammered. And the master of ceremonies basically says to the caterer, you suppose, to bring out the Boone's Farm after everybody's drunk. But this is the best tasting wine of the entire season. Well, so why this turning water into wine? Well, wine in Hebrew culture is a signifier of joy and celebration and happiness. So you have that. And John also, I think, isn't quite finished with the Greeks. The Greeks had a festival of Dionysus. Now, if you want to know who Dionysus is, go back and watch last year's Summer Olympic Open ceremonies. And that table that everybody thought they were mocking the Lord's Supper, they were not. That was Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, and that is a very common image that was borrowed for the Last Supper as well. So Dionysus was said to turn the rivers of Andros, the Greek island Andros. Every spring, the rivers would run for 3 days and 3 nights with wine. And so John knows this story. And so John isn't just appealing to the Hebrew audience here. He's taking another little swipe at, just as he did with Logos, he's adapting a Greek story and putting it here to say, well, you got your guy, this is our guy. And he can turn water into wine as well. And then the third section of chapter 2, mayhem. Jesus leaves the wedding, goes to the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, and cleanses it, and throws out all the money changers and the crooks and the con men. This is the first Passover, and we come to our first major conflict between John and the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptics, all three, place the cleansing of the temple during Holy Week, Monday of Holy Week, to be specific, at the end of Jesus' ministry. John has it at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Not to mention that he was in Cana on one day and Jerusalem the next, but it's a 3-day walk. So what's going on? John is doing what John does. I told you this was going to happen. He isn't concerned with the timeline. He's moving things around because he is doing something very specific with the story of Jesus. And some say, to reconcile the accounts, that Jesus must have cleansed the temple twice. Once at the beginning of his ministry and once at the end. Not a chance. One time was enough to get you killed. You weren't getting away with that. That's ultimately what got Jesus killed by the religious authorities. And John places it here on purpose. He wants it to set the tone of the gospel, this conflict, the eventual condemnation of Jesus, and he wants to set up the discourse Jesus is about to have with Nicodemus. So he's got to get Jesus into Jerusalem for that. And that's why he puts it together. I think I included this for you, and I agree with what William Barclay says. John is much more concerned with the truth than he is the facts. What an interesting statement that is right there. He's not following the synoptic line. He's moving things, and this will not be the only time he does it. He'll do this many more times throughout the gospel. Now, slide 6, if you would, or 7, whichever one was. Why does Jesus cleanse the temple? Every person had to go to the temple and pay a temple tax at Passover. In person, with temple currency. Now, this is a predominantly Roman, Greco-Roman world. You don't just have temple currency laying around. So when they arrived at the temple for this big celebration that was kind of like Christmas, Thanksgiving, and 4th of July all wrapped into one, everybody's there. You get there and you want to pay your tax. Well, you're carrying around Roman money or Greek money. And so they said, well, you have to exchange that. And the exchange rate is frightening in its amount. So I give you a $10 bill, and you give me back 10 cents. It was that kind of exchange for the temple tax. And everything else went into the coffers. And then you also had to bring a sacrificial animal. You bring your animal. You've hauled this lamb 300 miles, dragging it to get it to sacrifice. They take one look at it and they say, it's blemished. What do you mean it's blemished? It's perfect. Nope, you'll have to buy one here. So Jesus arrives, and you've got this filthy exchange system. You've got this barnyard set up right out in the holy courts where you're exchanging animals, and they're fleecing the flock. They're stealing from every person that arrives, and it was more than Jesus could take. And he makes a whip, and he lays it to their hides, and he turns over tables and kicks them all out, and causes quite a stir. Then Jesus does something that really blew their minds. He basically says, this temple, it's over. It's coming down. And at this point, the temple began, Herod began building the temple about 20 years BC. And by this time, it's 27, 28, 29 AD. So this has been a 50-year building project so far. And it wouldn't be completed until 64 AD. So this is an 85-year work project. You think government work is slow. Can you imagine? 85 years, and it was in existence for 6 years, and the Romans burned it to the ground. So Jesus is speaking of that temple collapsing, and Jesus is speaking of himself, his body, of him dying, and then being raised to life. And in saying that, by the time John writes, we're already going in. Judaism is going in this direction and Christianity is going in this direction. And so what John was anticipating, maybe from Paul, is this embodied spirituality. You don't need a place, you don't need a temple, because Jesus, as the instrument of God, takes up residence within us. Do you not know that you are the temples of God? So you see that transition taking place even as early in John's gospel as here. Questions before we get to the third chapter, and I have 12 minutes, so let's get these quick. Sorta. He married into a Jewish family. The question was, is Herod a Jew? I didn't get into the context last week. Herod is at the top of what we might call an ethnarchy, a monarchy that's ethnically rooted with the Jewish people. But Herod was a Roman, from Rome, but he married into the last remaining members of the royal Jewish family. They had all the men had died, and it was all ladies left, and so they didn't have queens. But he married one of them and became king, and convinced Octavius, Augustus, to make him king of the Jews in about 14 BC. And so that's what he became. And then when he died, two of his sons took over that territory as well. And they are the key players in Jesus' ministry. Good question. Very good question. All right, I have to get... I thought last week would be the hardest to get all the material in. But if you look at John 1, 2, and 3, John 1 is enough for 2 hours. And John 3 is enough for 10 hours. I've got now 11 minutes to do chapter 3. Nicodemus, numbers, necessity. Nicodemus is one of the most fascinating characters to me in John's gospel. So he comes to Jesus at night for one of 3 reasons. One, he's afraid. Jesus has just cleansed the temple. That could be one thing. 2, John is contrasting light and darkness again. A man coming out of the darkness of religion, coming to the light that is Jesus. Or 3, Nicodemus is following the instruction of the Talmud, which says the best time to do your spiritual study is at night when you have fewer distractions. It's probably that one. And he comes to Jesus. He is a Pharisee, and he is a member of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin will be the ones that condemn Jesus to death and hand him over to Pilate. Nicodemus is an insider in that regard. He is not someone you would expect to be a follower of Jesus. He's a genuine seeker, and he produces from Jesus those words, John 3:3, you must be born again. I'm not a Greek scholar. That is a terrible translation. it should read, you must be born from above. You say, well, that sounds about like the same thing. Not really. Because what John has in Jesus' mouth here, he is saying that you must be God awakened. That's what he is saying. You must become heaven aware, God conscious. The born again thing is kind of sets us on a different path, but the born again language is so stuck in our English language that most translators will put a note there, but the best translation is born above. Nicodemus doesn't understand this at first, but he seems to get it. John 7:45 through 52. Listen to this. This is years by John's accounting later. When the temple guards returned without having arrested Jesus, the leading priests and Pharisees demanded, "Why didn't you bring him in?" "We have never heard anyone speak like this," the guards responded. And they said, "Have you been led astray too?" And then you get down, and they're wanting to kill Jesus. And then you get to verse 50 of John 7. Then Nicodemus, the leader who had met with Jesus earlier, spoke up. "Is it legal to convict a man before he has been given a hearing?" he asked them. And they replied, what a put down. "Are you from Galilee too? Are you one of those hillbillies? Are you one of those rebel rousers?" Because Nicodemus, even at this point, has gone over to the Jesus side. And it disturbs people. And then in John 19, I won't take time to read it, but when Jesus dies on Good Friday, Joseph of Arimathea purchases the tomb, and Nicodemus purchases the ointments for the embalming of Jesus' body. So he's there early in Jesus' ministry, and he's there at the end as well. The second reference is to Numbers. I think I'm going to skip that one tonight. Read that for yourself. It's really strange. Jesus makes a reference to Numbers 21 about being lifted up as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness. If we have time, I'll come back to that. But I have to get, of course, to necessity to John 3:16 real quick. What does the world need? The redeeming love of God. And John 3:16, the most beloved verse in the entire New Testament, maybe the Bible, is this fundamental summary of the good news. And it follows on all the way down to verse number 21. And it brings the first great dialogue of John's gospel to a close there with Nicodemus. So we've had the first of 7 miracles and the first of the 7 great conversations. But John 3:16, "For this is how God loved the world. He gave His one and only Son, so that everyone who believes in Him will not perish, but have eternal life." All right, this is how God loved the world. Next slide, if you would. The word chosen there, when he uses the word love, is agape. There are about 3 different words for love in the Greek language. This one is used exclusively of self-giving, sacrificial, deep, hold nothing back love. Where we get our word Philadelphia is a Greek word for love, about brotherly love, the city of brotherly love. And then you have eros, which is more like a lusty love. Agape is unto itself. It's this divine, empowered love. This is how God loved the world. And then if you really want to know what that looks like, it'd be 1 Corinthians 13 for a full description of what this kind of love looks like. And then the word world, the cosmos, everything that has been created. For God so loved, gave His Son to the world, to the universe. So while John can in one hand say the world is dark, the world is ugly, the world is ignorant, the world is non-believing, at the same time he says God loves this world and is giving to this world. And then there's that phrase again, one and only, monogenes, we would say, one and only, uniquely born, the only one of its species. Everyone who believes, the Greek word is pistis, which is just an ugly translation, but that's how it is. It's where we get the English word epistemology, which is the study of how we come to believe things. And then if you believe in Jesus, you get aionios, which is eternal or abiding or constant life, and the word used for life is Zoe. It's not bios. Bios is physical life. Zoe is deep spiritual life. So if we were to go back and give a fuller translation of John 3:16, it would read something like this. For this is how God patiently, kindly, truthfully, faithfully, persistently, sacrificially, and unselfishly loved the cosmos and the created order that God was already sustaining. God gifted and bestowed His one uniquely born Son so that everyone and all who put their trust in the Son can never be fully destroyed, but will experience abiding spiritual life forever. That would be the full Greek translation of John 3:16, if you get all the meaning of all those words crammed in there. And then one last note, and I'll take the final questions that you have. I always knew that John was recreating the book of Genesis. But a few days ago, I started counting days and scratching things down, and this will hold up, I think. Look at this. Genesis begins, and the reason I chose John for this year's study is we finished Genesis last year, and the connection is there. Genesis begins, in the beginning, God. John begins, in the beginning was the Word. On day one, God creates light. Day one in the Gospel of John, John says that Jesus came as light and life to the world. Day two in Genesis, God creates the skies. Day two, John sees a dove descend from the skies on Jesus. Day three, Genesis creates land. Day three, Jesus calls Peter the rock. Day four, the sun, the moon, and the stars. Day four, in John's gospel, he says to Nathanael, you will see heaven open. Day five begins, let the water teem with life. Day five, in John's gospel, Jesus turns water to wine. Day six, humanity is created in Genesis. Day seven, Jesus cleanses the temple and speaks of the new humanity that will make up Him as the new temple of God. Day seven, He rests. And day seven in the Gospel of John, they retreat back into Judea. Is that not amazing? Is that not wonderful? That's what John is up to. Well, why did John rearrange these things? This is why John rearranged these things. He is building a second Genesis for the new creation that Christ is bringing to the world. It's clever. It's subtle. It's subtle, especially in our English translations. We can sometimes miss it. But you go back and start counting those days. And so what you see is by the time we get here to we're going to be in chapter 4 next week, we've only had 6 days of Jesus' life. And the Gospels only give us 59. Add up all the days you have of Jesus, you have 2 months. And John has said a whole lot in 6 days. A whole lot. And I haven't even scratched the surface. Questions? Yes, Denny.
What do you take the word believe to actually mean?
The question is, what do you take the word believe to actually mean? The Greek word is a transactional word used to describe someone that is signing a contract. Pistis. They are trusting that the terms of this contract will be fulfilled when they put their name to it. So if you bring that word to belief as it's used in the New Testament, and we are called to believe, we are called to trust the terms that Jesus has offered. So when Jesus says, if you believe in me, you'll never perish but have eternal life. To believe that is to say, I believe that will come to pass. It is also, pistis is also used to describe one putting their weight down. So, imagine walking across ice and you put your foot out there and you test it. And then if you say, hey, it's strong enough, then you stand on it. And that's also another meaning of the word belief. I believe this will hold my weight, and so I will entrust myself to it. And that's how it's used in Hebrews and how Paul uses the word.
So in essence, that second definition would be you believe in a way that you actually change your behavior. So that, I mean, it's not just, oh, I believe and I say this or whatever, you know, I heard this, but you believe it in a way that things have changed because of that.
Right. So Denny's comment is that this kind of belief would change someone's behavior, the way they act, and the answer is true. You'll exercise this kind of belief tonight. You're gonna leave here, and before you get home, you will encounter a red light. And you will step on your brake with all the faith in the universe that you are going to stop. Right? But that's an act of faith. Do you check the calipers and the brakes every time you get behind the wheel of the car? No. The car has served you well enough that you believe that when you apply that brake pedal, the mechanisms underneath will cause that vehicle to stop. That is faith. But it's not ungrounded faith. It has been proven to you enough that I will trust it. I will entrust myself to it. I'll put my weight into it that it will hold its end of the bargain. That's one way of, in contemporary terms, of looking at it.
It's an act of surrender. Believing is an act of surrender.
Mickey's comment is that believing is an act of surrender. And I would absolutely. Whether you're putting the brakes on, you've handed yourself over, if you've signed a contract, now that's surrender, isn't it? All of these examples hold to that exact thing. And it also means that you're not trusting yourself. You know, and then talking about, we're back to 12-step talk and why it works so well. We have entrusted ourselves to a higher power because we understand that that's the only means by which we can regain sanity and regain our lives. Well,
Legal, contractual, you use the word binding.
Binding. Yeah, so John's making the comment that if you speak of it in illegal terms, you would use the term binding. And that's I like that choice of words. And to go back to what Denny said, James uses faith exactly like you described it, that it changes your behavior. James is the one who says, faith without works is dead. And what he is saying is, if you really believe, it's going to change the way you behave. You can't just say, I believe. Anybody can say that. Is it changing your actions in such a way that you're in a life of surrender, in a life of binding trust? Good comments. Other questions? No, to you first.
I've been watching The Chosen.
Yes.
And I was just watching the Nicodemus came during my night, and just all this comes to life. So if anyone's never seen it, I highly recommend it.
If you haven't seen The Chosen, the comment was about watching Chosen on Amazon Prime. It really is good. And they play it pretty close to the line, to the text. They do a good job with it, and it does help awaken. You actually see human beings in conversation with each other, facial expressions. You can see in the Nicodemus one, the confusion and the questioning on his face, and then the resolution, and it's really, really good.
Growing up in Sunday school and studying about the apostles being fishers of men, they were little fishermen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Followers of Christ. When you read this, and I'm struck already, just and the things that we were talking about tonight in the first 3 chapters. It's almost like John has a university education. I mean, that he is what knowledge he has to see a way to propagandize his book,
Mhm.
to do what he's setting out to do, the way he arranges. I mean, it's like a literature major and a theology major, you know, and a minister all rolled into one. I was led to believe these were just simple,
Mhm.
ordinary people, but he seems a very educated man to me.
The short of the comment here for those that are still online is that you get the appearance that the disciples of Jesus, they're fishermen, they're common people, they're simple, they're uneducated, and to a large degree that is true. And then you read John and it's brilliant. And there's theological reflection, and there's interaction with the Greek world, and there's other literature that's lurking behind the scenes. Both of these are true. If we think of, if I can go on just a few more minutes, I won't hold you much longer. But if we think of John as getting his thoughts together as an old man who has now lived longer in Asia Minor, in modern-day Turkey, than he ever lived in Palestine. So we think that he leaves and goes, to Ephesus and to Asia Minor after the crucifixion, as Jesus, we'll see this later when we get to it, Jesus entrusted the care of his mother to John on the cross. She's your mother now. And so if John is 17, 18 years old, like some folks believe, he's taking all this in as a youth. He doesn't process it for decades. It'd be like sitting down. I don't think this is pushing the analogy too far. It'd be like sitting down, and I've had this privilege a couple times, and it's amazing what is said, with a D-Day veteran who never spoke to anyone about what he did until he's a grandpa in the chair. And somebody says, well, could you tell me what happened at Normandy? And here's a man who's had 60 years maybe to think about what happened. And how he communicates it then as an old man this has stirred within him all these years. Powerful stuff.
And he can see
And he,
what that has done.
yes,
And that's what Peter.
yeah.
He lived the longest. Peter.
Yeah, John lived the longest. Yeah. Yeah, he lived the longest by tradition. The other,
The path that
yes. And he's at the end of a century, the very first century, and he sees where Christianity has come, and I think he sees where it's going. That it's going to break the bounds, obviously, of the Near East. It was already in Rome. It was already in the heart of the empire. It was following the path of Alexander the Great. Wherever the Greek culture had gone, Christianity was already moving into those areas. That is a good question. The question is, wonder what John would think today about Christianity. That's a great question. I'm not going to answer it. John 4, 5, and 6, and hopefully we can spend a little more time with him. John 6 has the feeding of the 5,000, and I am the bread of life. John 4, great encounter with the woman at the well as they go through Samaria. John 5 is not without its highlights as well, but we'll pick up those 3 chapters next week, and we'll see you on Sunday. You're dismissed.